1,000 Miles Up the Nile, Section 65. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. 1,000 Miles Up the Nile by Amelia B. Edwards. Chapter 21. Thebes, Part 5. To rob the dead was always a lucrative trade at Thebes, and we may be certain that the splendid pharaohs who slept in the valley of the tombs of the kings went to their dark palaces magnificently equipped for the life to come. When, indeed, one thinks of the jewels, furniture, vases, ointments, clothing, arms, and precious documents, which were as certainly buried in those tombs as the royal mummies for whom they were excavated, it seems far more wonderful that the parure of one queen should have escaped, rather than that all the rest of these dead and gone royalties should have fallen among thieves. Of all the tombs in the valley of Bab el Malik, one would rather, I think, have discovered that of Rameses III. As he was one of the richest of the pharaohs, and an undoubted virtuoso in his tastes, so we may be sure that his tomb was furnished with all kinds of beautiful and precious things. What would we not give now to find some of those elaborate gold and silver vases, those cushioned thrones and sofas, those bows and quivers and shirts of mail so carefully catalogued on the walls of the side chambers in the first corridor? I do not doubt that specimens of all these things were buried with the king and left ready for his use. He died believing that his Ka would enjoy and make use of these treasures, and that his soul would come back after long cycles of probation and make its home once more in the mummied body. He thought he should rise as from sleep, cast off his bandages, eat and be refreshed, and put on sandals and scented vestments, and take his staff in his hand, and go forth again into the light of everlasting day. Poor ghost, wandering bodiless through space! Where now are thy funeral baked meats, thy changes of raiment, thy perfumes and precious ointments? Where is that body for which thou wert once so solicitous, and without which resurrection is impossible? One fancies thee sighing forlorn through these desolate halls when all is silent and the moon shines down the valley. Life at Thebes is made up of incongruities. A morning among temples is followed by an afternoon of antiquity hunting, and a day of meditation among tombs winds up with a dinner party on board some friend's dahabeah, or a fantasia at the British Consulate. L. and the writer did their fair share of antiquity hunting both at Luxor and elsewhere, but chiefly at Luxor. I may say indeed that our life here was one long pursuit of the pleasures of the chase. The game, it is true, was prohibited, but we enjoyed it none the less because it was illegal. Perhaps we enjoyed it the more. There were whispers about this time of a tomb that had been discovered on the western side, a wonderful tomb rich in all kinds of treasure. No one, of course, had seen these things. No one knew who had found them. No one knew where they were hidden. But there was a solemn secrecy about certain of the Arabs, and a conscious look about some of the visitors, and an air of awakened vigilance about the government officials, which savoured of mystery. These rumours by and by assumed more definite proportions. Dark hints were dropped of a possible papyrus, the M.B.'s babbled of mummies, and an American dahabeah lying innocently off Carnac was reported to have a mummy on board. Now neither L. nor the writer desired to become the happy proprietor of an ancient Egyptian, but the papyrus was a thing to be thought of. In a fatal hour we expressed a wish to see it. From that moment every mummy-snatcher in the place regarded us as his lawful prey. Beguiled into one den after another, we were shown all the stolen goods in Thebes. Some of the things were very curious and interesting. In one house we were offered 2 bronze vases, each with a band of delicately engraved hieroglyphs running round the lip; also a square stand of basket-work in 2 colours, precisely like that engraved in Sir G. Wilkinson's first volume, after the original in the Berlin Museum. Pieces of mummy case and a wall sculpture and sepulchre tablets abounded, and on one occasion we were introduced into the presence of a mummy. All these houses were tombs, and in this one the mummy was stowed away in a kind of recess at the end of a long rock-cut passage, probably the very place once occupied by the original tenant. It was a mummy of the same period as that which we saw disentombed under the auspices of the governor, and was enclosed in the same kind of cartonnage, patterned in many colours on a white ground. I shall never forget that curious scene, the dark and dusty vault, the Arabs with their lanterns, the mummy in its gaudy cerements lying on an old mat at our feet. Meanwhile we tried in vain to get sight of the coveted papyrus. A grave Arab dropped in once or twice after nightfall, and talked it over vaguely with the dragoman, but never came to the point. He offered it first with a mummy for £100. Finding, however, that we would neither buy his papyrus unseen nor his mummy at any price, he haggled and hesitated for a day or two, evidently trying to play us off against some rival or rivals unknown, and finally disappeared. These rivals, we afterwards found out, were the M.B.'s. They bought both mummy and papyrus at an enormous price, and then, unable to endure the perfume of their ancient Egyptian, drowned the dear departed at the end of a week. Other purchasers were possibly less sensitive. We heard, at all events, of 15 mummies successfully insinuated through the Alexandrian custom house by a single agent that winter. There is, in fact, a growing passion for mummies among Nile travellers. Unfortunately, the prices rise with the demand, and although the mine is practically inexhaustible, a mummy nowadays becomes not only a prohibited but a costly luxury. At Luxor the British, American, and French consuls are Arabs. The Prussian consul is a Copt. The Austrian consul is, or was, an American. The French consul showed us over the old tumble-down building called the French House, which, though but a rude structure of palm timbers and sun-dried clay, built partly against and partly over the temple of Luxor, has its place in history. For there, in 1829, Champollion and Rossellini lived and worked together, during part of their long sojourn at Thebes. Rossellini tells how they used to sit up at night, dividing the fruits of the day's labour, Champollion copying whatever might be useful for his Egyptian grammar, and Rossellini the new words that furnished materials for his dictionary. There, too, lodged the naval officer sent out by the French in 1831, to remove the obelisk which now stands in the Place de la Concorde. And there, writing those charming letters that delight the world, Lady Duff Gordon lingered through the last few winters of her life. The rooms in which she first lived, and the balcony in which she took such pleasure, were no longer accessible, owing to the ruinous state of one of the staircases, but we saw the rooms she last inhabited. Her couch, her rug, her folding chair, were there still. The walls were furnished with a few cheap prints and a pair of tin sconces. All was very bare and comfortless. We asked if it was just like this when the Sitta lived here. The Arab consul replied that she had a table and some books. He looked himself in the last stage of consumption, and spoke and moved like one that had done with life. We were shocked at the dreariness of the place till we went to the window. That window, which commanded the Nile and the western plain of Thebes, furnished the room and made its poverty splendid. The sun was near setting; we could distinguish the mounds and the pylons of Medinet Habu and the site of the Ramesseum. The terraced cliffs, overtopped by the pyramidal mountain of Bab el Malik, burned crimson against a sky of stainless blue. The footpath leading to the valley of the tombs of the kings showed like a hot white scar winding along the face of the rocks. The river gave back the sapphire tones of the sky. I thought I could be well content to spend many a winter in no matter how comfortless a lodging, if I only had that wonderful view, with its infinite beauty of light and colour and space, and its history and its mystery always before my windows. Another historical house is that built by Sir G. Wilkinson, among the tombs of Sheikh Abd el Qurna. Here he lived while amassing the materials for his manners and customs of the ancient Egyptians, and here Lepsius and his company of artists put up while at work on the western bank. Science makes little impression on the native mind. No one now remembers Champollion or Rossellini or Sir G. Wilkinson, but every Arab in Luxor cherishes the memory of Lady Duff Gordon in his heart of hearts, and speaks of her with blessings. The French house was built over the roof of the sanctuary at the southern end of the temple. At the northern end, built up between the enormous sandstone columns of the great colonnade, was the house of Mustapha Aga, most hospitable and kindly of British consuls. Mustapha Aga had travelled in Europe, and spoke fluent Italian, English, and French. His eldest son was governor of Luxor; his younger, the little Ahmed whom Lady Duff Gordon delighted to educate, having spent 2 years in England as the guest of Lord D., had become an accomplished Englishman. In the round of gaiety that goes on at Luxor the British consulate played the leading part. Mustapha Aga entertained all the English dahabiyehs, and all the English dahabiyehs entertained Mustapha Aga. We were invited to several fantasias at the consulate, and dined with Mustapha Aga at his suburban house the evening before we left Luxor. The appointed hour was 8:30 p.m. We arrived amid much barking of dogs, and were received by our host in a large empty hall surrounded by a divan. Here we remained till dinner was announced. We were next ushered through an anteroom where 2 turbaned and barefooted servants were in waiting, the one with a brass basin and ewer, the other with an armful of Turkish towels. We then, each in turn, held our hands over the basin, had water poured on them, and received a towel apiece. These towels we were told to keep, and they served for dinner napkins. The anteroom opened into a brilliantly lighted dining room of moderate size, having in the centre a round brass table with an upright fluted rim, like a big tray. For each person were placed a chair, a huge block of bread, a wooden spoon, 2 tumblers, and a bouquet. Plates, knives, forks, there were none. The party consisted of the happy couple, the director of the Luxor telegraph office, L., the writer, Ahmed, and our host. "To-night we are all Arabs," said Mustapha Aga, as he showed us where to sit. "We drink Nile water, and we eat with our fingers." So we drank Nile water, and for the first time in our lives we ate with our fingers. In fact, we found them exceedingly useful. The dinner was excellent. Without disrespect to our own accomplished chef, or to the accomplished chefs of our various friends upon the river, I am bound to say that it was the very best dinner I ever ate out of Europe. Everything was hot, quickly served, admirably dressed, and the best of its kind. Here is the menu. Menu, March 31st, 1874. White soup, turkey. Fish, fried samnak. Entrees: stewed pigeons, spinach and rice. Roast, dal. Entrees: kebabs of mutton, kebabs of lamb's kidneys, tomatoes with rice. Roast: turkey with cucumber sauce. Entree: pilaf of rice. Second course: mishmish, rus bleben, kunafa, totla. These dishes were placed one at a time in the middle of the table, and rapidly changed. Each dipped his own spoon in the soup, dived into the stew, and pulled off pieces of fish or lamb with his fingers. Having no plates, we made plates of our bread. Meanwhile Mustapha Aga, like an attentive host, tore off an especially choice morsel now and then, and handed it to one or another of his guests. To eat gracefully with one's fingers is a fine art. To carve with them skilfully is a science. None of us, I think, will soon forget the wonderful way in which our host attacked and vanquished the turkey, a solid colossus weighing 20 pounds, and roasted to perfection. Half rising, he turned back his cuff, poised his wrist, and driving his forefinger and thumb deep into the breast, brought out a long, stringy, smoking fragment, which he deposited on the plate of the writer. Thus begun, the turkey went round the table amid peals of laughter, and was punished by each in turn. The pilaf which followed is always the last dish served at an Egyptian or Turkish dinner. After this, our spoons were changed, and the sweets were put upon the table. The drinks throughout were plain water, rice water, and lemonade. Some native musicians played in the anteroom during dinner, and when we rose from the table we washed our hands, as before. We now returned to the large hall, and not being accomplished in the art and mystery of sitting cross-legged, curled ourselves up on the divans as best we could. The writer was conducted by Mustapha Aga to the corner seat at the upper end of the room, where he said the Princess of Wales had sat when their Royal Highnesses dined with him the year before. We were then served with pipes and coffee. The gentlemen smoked chibouks and cigarettes, while for us there were gorgeous rose-water nargilehs with long flexible tubes and amber mouthpieces. L. had the Princess's pipe, and smoked it very cleverly all the evening. By and by came the Governor, the Cadi of Luxor, the Prussian Consul and his son, and some 3 or 4 grave-looking merchants in rich silk robes and ample turbans. Meanwhile the band, 2 fiddles, a tambourine, a ndarabuka, played at intervals at the lower end of the hall, pipes, coffee, and lemonade went continually around, and the entertainment wound up, as native entertainments always do wind up at Luxor, with a performance of Gwazi. End of section 65. A Thousand Miles Up the Nile, section 66. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A Thousand Miles Up the Nile by Amelia B. Edwards. Chapter 21. Thebes, Part 6. We had already seen these dancers at 2 previous fantasias, and we admired them no more the 3rd time than the first. They wore baggy Turkish trousers, loose gowns of gaudy pattern, and a profusion of jewellery. The première danseuse was a fine woman and rather handsome, but in the belle of the company, a thick-lipped Nubian, we could discover no charm whatever. The performances of the Gwazi, which are very ungraceful and almost wholly pantomimic, have been too often described to need description here. Only once indeed did we see them perform an actual dance, and then they swam lightly to and fro, clattering their castanets, crossing and recrossing, and bounding every now and then down the whole length of the room. This dance, we were told, was of unknown antiquity. They sang occasionally, but their voices were harsh and their melodies inharmonious. There was present, however, one native performer whom we had already heard many times, and of whose skill we never tired. This was the leader of the little band, an old man who played the kemenga, or cocoanut fiddle. A more unpromising instrument than the kemenga it would be difficult to conceive, yet our old Arab contrived to make it discourse most eloquent music. His solos consisted of plaintive airs and extemporized variations, embroidered with difficult, and sometimes extravagant, cadenzas. He always began sedately, but warmed to his work as he went on, seeming at last to forget everything but his own delight in his own music. At such times one could see that he was weaving some romance in his thoughts, and translating it into sounds. As the strings throbbed under his fingers, the whole man became inspired, and more than once when, in shower after shower of keen, despairing notes, he had described the wildest anguish of passion, I have observed his colour change and his hand tremble. Although we heard him repeatedly, and engaged him more than once when we had friends to dinner, I am sorry to say that I forget the name of this really great artist. He is, however, celebrated throughout the Thebaid, and is constantly summoned to Erment, Esna, Kenna, Gerga, and other large towns, to perform at private entertainments. While at Luxor, we went one Sunday morning to the Coptic church, a large building at the northern extremity of the village. Church, schools, and bishop's house are here grouped under one roof and enclosed in a courtyard, for Luxor is the centre of one of the 12 seas into which Coptic Egypt is divided. The church, which has been rebuilt of late years, is constructed of sun-dried brick, having a small apse towards the east, and at the lower or western end a screened atrium for the women. The centre aisle is perhaps 30 feet in width, the side aisles, if aisles they can be called, being thickly planted with stone pillars supporting round arches. These pillars came from Carnac, and were the gift of the Khedive. They have lotus bud capitals, and measure about 15 feet high in the shaft. At the upper end of the nave, some 18 or 20 feet in advance of the apse, there stands a very beautiful screen inlaid in the old Coptic style with cedar, ebony, rosewood, ivory, and mother of pearl. This screen is the pride of the church. Through the opening in the centre one looks straight into a little wagon-roofed apse, which contains a small table and a suspended lamp, and is as dark as the sanctuary of an Egyptian temple. The reading desk, like a rickety office stool, faces the congregation, and just inside the screen stands the bishop's chair. Upon this plan, which closely resembles the plan of the first cathedral of St. Peter at Rome, most Coptic churches are built. They vary chiefly in the number of apses, some having as many as 5. The atrium generally contains a large tank, called the Epiphany tank, into which, in memory of the baptism of our Lord, the men plunge at their festival of El Gitas. Young Todros, the son of the Prussian consul, conducted us to the church. We went in at about 11 o'clock, and witnessed the end of the service, which had then been going on since daybreak. The atrium was crowded with women and children, and the side aisles with men of the poorer sort. A few groups of better-dressed Copts were gathered near the screen listening to a black-robed deacon, who stood reading at the reading desk with a lighted taper in his left hand. A priest in a white vestment embroidered on the breast and hood with a red Maltese cross was squatting on his heels at the entrance to the adytum. The bishop, all in black with a black turban, sat with his back to the congregation. Every face was turned upon us when we came in. The reader paused. The white-robed priest got up. Even the bishop looked round. Presently a couple of acolytes, each carrying 2 cane-bottomed chairs, came bustling down the nave, and, unceremoniously driving away all were standing near, placed us in a row across the middle of the church. This interruption over, the reading resumed. We now observed with some surprise that every word of the lessons as they were read in Coptic was translated viva voce into Arabic by a youth in a surplice who stood against the screen facing the congregation. He had no book, but went on fluently enough, following close upon the voice of the reader. This, we were told, was done only during the reading of the lessons, the Gospel, and the Lord's Prayer. The rest of the service is performed without translation, and the Coptic, being a dead language, is consequently unintelligible to the people. When the reading of the Gospel was over, the deacon retired. The priest then came forward and made a sign to the school children, who ran up noisily from all parts of the church, and joined with the choristers in a wild kind of chant. It seemed to us that this chant concluded the first part of the service. The second part closely resembled the celebration of Mass. The priest came to the door of the screen, looked at the congregation, folded his hands palm to palm, went up to the threshold of the apse, and began reciting what sounded like a litany. He then uncovered the sacred vessels, which till now had been concealed under 2 blue cotton handkerchiefs, and turning, shook the handkerchiefs towards the people. He then consecrated the wine and wafer, elevated the host, and himself partook of the Eucharist in both elements. A little bell was rung during the consecration and again at the elevation. The people, meanwhile, stood very reverently, with their heads bent, but no one knelt during any part of the service. After this, the officiating priest washed his hands in a brass basin, and the deacon, who was also the schoolmaster, came round the church holding up his scarf, which was heaped full of little cakes of unleavened bread. These he distributed to all present. An acolyte followed with a plate, and collected the offerings of the congregation. We now thought the service was over, but there remained 4 wee, crumpled, brown mites of babies to be christened. These small Copts were carried up the church by 4 acolytes, followed by 4 anxious fathers. The priest then muttered a short prayer, crossed the babies with water from the basin in which he had washed his hands, drank the water, wiped the basin out with a piece of bread, ate the bread, and dismissed the newly made Christians with a hasty blessing. Finally, the bishop, who had taken no part in the service, nor even partaken of the Eucharist, came down from his chair and stood before the altar to bless the congregation. Hereupon all the men and boys ranged themselves in single file and trooped through between the screen and the apse, crowding in at one side and out at the other, each being touched by the bishop on his cheek as he went by. If they lagged, the bishop clapped his hands impatiently, and the schoolmaster drove them through faster. When there were no more to come, the women and little girls, be it observed, coming in for no share of this benediction, the priest took off his vestments and laid them in a heap upon the altar. The deacon distributed a basketful of blessed cakes among the poor of the congregation, and the bishop walked down the nave, eating a cake and giving a bit here and there to the best-dressed Copts as he went along. So ended this interesting and curious service, which I have described thus minutely for the reason that it represents, with probably but little change, the earliest ceremonial of Christian worship in Egypt. Before leaving, we asked permission to look at the books from which the service had been read. They were all very old and dilapidated. The New Testament, however, was in better condition than the rest, and was beautifully written upon vellum, in red and black ink. The Coptic, of course, looks like Greek to the eyes of the uninitiated, but some of the illuminated capitals struck us as bearing a marked resemblance to certain of the more familiar hieroglyphic characters. While we were examining the books, the bishop sent his servant to invite us to pay him a visit. We accordingly followed the man up an outer flight of wooden steps at one corner of the courtyard, and were shown into a large room built partly over the church. Here we found the bishop, handsome, plump, dignified, with soft brown eyes and a slightly grizzled beard, seated cross-legged on a divan, and smoking his chibouk. On a table in the middle of the room stood 2 or 3 blue and white bottles of Oriental porcelain. The windows, which were sashless and very large, looked over to Carnac. The sparrows flew in and out as they listed. The bishop received us very amiably, and the proceedings opened as usual with pipes and coffee. The conversation which followed consisted chiefly of questions on our part and of answers on his. We asked the extent of his diocese, and learned that it reached from Aswan on the south to Kenna on the north. The revenue of the sea, he said, was wholly derived from endowments in land. He estimated the number of Copts in Luxor at 2,000, being 2/3 of the entire population. The church was built and decorated in the time of his predecessor. He had himself been bishop here for rather more than 4 years. We then spoke of the service we had just witnessed, and of the books we had seen. I showed him my prayer book, which he examined with much curiosity. I explained the differences indicated by the black and the rubricated matter, and pointed out the parts that were sung. He was, however, more interested in the outside than in the contents, and tapped the binding once or twice to see if it were leather or wood. As for the gilt corners and clasp, he undoubtedly took them for solid gold. The conversation next turned upon Coptic, the idle man asking him if he believed it to be the tongue actually spoken by the ancient Egyptians. To this he replied, "Yes, undoubtedly. What else should it be?" The idle man hereupon suggested that it seemed to him, from what he had just seen of the church books, as if it might be a corrupt form of Byzantine Greek. The bishop shook his head. "The Coptic is a distinct language," he said. 8 Greek letters were added to the Coptic alphabet upon the introduction of Christianity into Egypt, and since that time many Greek words have been imported into the Coptic vocabulary. But the main body of the tongue is Coptic, purely, and it has no radical affinity whatever with the Greek. This was the longest speech we heard him make, and he delivered it with some emphasis. I then asked him if the Coptic was in all respects a dead language, to which he replied that many Coptic words, such as the names of the months and of certain festivals, were still in daily use. This, however, was not quite what I meant, so I put the question in another form, and asked if he thought any fragments of the tongue yet survived among the peasantry. He pondered a moment before replying. "That," he said, "is a question to which it is difficult to give a precise answer, but I think you might yet find in some of the remoter villages an old man here and there who would understand it a little." I thought this a very interesting reply to a very interesting question. After sitting about half an hour we rose and took leave. The bishop shook hands with us all around, and, but that we protested against it, would have accompanied us to the head of the stairs. This interview was altogether very pleasant. The Copts are said to be sullen in manner, and so bigoted that even a Muslim is less an object of dislike to him than a Christian of any other denomination. However this may be, we saw nothing of it. We experienced, on the contrary, many acts of civility from the Copts with whom we were brought into communication. No traveller in Egypt should, I think, omit being present at a service in a Coptic church. For a Coptic church is now the only place in which one may hear the last utterances of that far-off race with whose pursuits and pleasures the tomb paintings make us so familiar. We know that great changes have come over the language since it was spoken by Rameses the Great and written by Pentar. We know that the Coptic of today bears to the Egyptian of the pharaohs some such resemblance, perhaps, as the English of Macaulay bears to the English of Chaucer. Yet it is, at bottom, the tongue of old Egypt, and it is something to hear the last lingering echoes of that ancient speech read by the undoubted descendants of the Egyptian people. In another 50 years or so, the Coptic will in all probability be superseded by the Arabic in the services of this church, and then the very tradition of its pronunciation will be lost. The Copts themselves, it is said, are fast going over to the dominant faith. Perhaps by the time our own descendants are counting the 2000th anniversary of the Christian era, both Copts and Coptic will be extinct in Egypt. A day or two after this we dropped down to Carnac, where we remained till the end of the week, and on the following Sunday we resumed our downward voyage. If the universe of literature was unconditioned, and the present book was independent of time and space, I would write another chapter here about Carnac. But Carnac, to be fairly dealt by, would ask, not a chapter, but a volume. So, having already told something of the impression first made upon us by that wilderness of wonders, I will say no more. End of section 66. A Thousand Miles Up the Nile, section 67. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A Thousand Miles Up the Nile by Amelia B. Edwards. Chapter 22. Abydos and Cairo, Part 1. Our last weeks on the Nile went by like one long, lazy summer's day. Events now were few. We had outstayed all our fellow travellers. Even the faithful Bagstones had long since vanished northwards, and the Philae was the last dahabeah of the year. Of the great sights of the river, we had only Abydos and Beni Hassan left to see, while for minor excursions, daily walks, and explorations by the way, we had little energy left. For the thermometer was rising higher, and the Nile was falling lower every day, and we should have been more than mortal if we had not felt the languid influences of the glowing Egyptian spring. The natives call it spring, but to our northern fancy it is spring, summer, and autumn in one. Of the splendour of the skies, of the lavish bounty of the soil at this season, only those who have lingered late in the land can form any conception. There is a breath of repose now about the landscape which it has never worn before. The winter green of the palms is fading fast. The harvests are ripening, the pigeons are pairing, the time of the singing of birds is come. There is just enough south wind most days to keep the boat straight and the sails from flapping. The heat is great, yet it is a heat which, up to a certain point, one can enjoy. The men ply their oars by night, and sleep under their benches, or croon old songs and tell stories among themselves by day. But for the thin canopy of smoke that hangs over the villages, one would fancy now that those clusters of mud huts were all deserted. Not a human being is to be seen on the banks when the sun is high. The buffaloes stand up to their necks in the shallows. The donkeys huddle together wherever there is shade. The very dogs have given up barking and lie asleep under the walls. The whole face of the country, and even of the Nile, is wonderfully changed since we first passed this way. The land, then newly squared off like a gigantic chessboard and intersected by thousands of little channels, is now one sea of yellowing grain. The river is become a labyrinth of sandbanks, some large, some small, some just beginning to thrust their heads above water, others so long that they divide the river for a mile or more at a stretch. Rais Hassan spends half his life at the prow, pulling for shallows, and when we thread our way down one of these sandy straits, it is for all the world like a bit of the Suez Canal. The banks, too, are twice as steep as they were when we went up. The lentil patches, which then blossomed on the slopes next the water's edge, now lie far back on the top of a steep brown ridge, at the foot of which stretches a moist flat planted with watermelons. Each melon plant is protected from the sun by a tiny gable roof of palm thatch. Meanwhile, the river being low and the banks high, we unfortunates benefit scarcely at all by the faint breezes that now and then ruffle the barley. Day by day, the thermometer, which hangs in the coolest corner of the saloon, creeps up higher and higher, working its way by degrees to above 99°, but never succeeding in getting quite up to 100. We, however, living in semi-darkness, with closed jalousies and wet sails hung round about the sides of the dahabeah, and wet towels hung up in our cabins, find 99° quite warm enough to be pleasant. The upper deck is of course well deluged several times a day, but even so it is difficult to keep the timbers from starting. Meanwhile L and the idle man devote their leisure to killing flies, keeping the towels wet, and sprinkling the floors. Our progress all this time is of the slowest. The men cannot row by day, and at night the sandbanks so hedge us in with dangers that the only possible way by which we can make a few miles between sunset and sunrise is by sheer hard punting. Now and then we come to a clear channel, and sometimes we get an hour or two of sweet south breeze, but these flashes of good luck are few and far between. In such wise, and in such a temperature, we found ourselves becalmed one morning within 6 miles of Dendera. Not even L could be induced to take a 6-mile donkey ride that day in the sun. The writer, however, ordered out her sketching tent, and paid a last visit to the temple, which, seen among the ripening splendour of miles of barley, looked gloomier and grander and more solitary than ever. 2 or 3 days later we came within reach of Abydos. Our proper course would have been to push on to Beliana, which is one of the recognized starting points for Abydos. But an unlucky sandbank barred the way, so we moored instead at Samada, a village about 2 miles nearer to the southward. Here our dragoman requisitioned the inhabitants for donkeys. As it happened, the harvest had begun in the neighbourhood, and all the beasts of burden were at work, so that it was near midday before we succeeded in getting together the 3 or 4 wretched little brutes with which we finally started. Not one of these steeds had ever before carried a rider. We had a frightful time with them. My donkey bolted about every 5 minutes. L's snarled like a camel and showed its teeth like a dog. The idle man's, bent on flattening its rider, lay down and rolled at short intervals. In this exciting fashion we somehow or another accomplished the 7 miles that separate Samada from Abydos. Skirting some palm groves and crossing the dry bed of a canal, we came out upon a vast plain, level as a lake, islanded here and there with villages, and presenting one undulating surface of bearded corn. This plain, the plain of ancient Thinis, runs parallel with the Nile, like the plain of Thebes, and is bound to the westward by a range of flat-topped mountains. The distance between the river and the mountains, however, is here much greater than at Thebes, being full 6 miles, while to north and south the view ends only with the horizon. Our way lies, at first, by a bridle track through the thick of the barley, then falls into the Beliana road, a raised causeway embanked some 20 feet above the plain. Along this road the country folk are coming and going. In the cleared spaces where the maize has been cut, little encampments of straw huts have sprung up. Yonder, steering their way by unseen paths, go strings of camels, their gawky necks and humped backs undulating above the surface of the corn, like galleys with fantastic prows upon a sea of rippling green. The pigeons fly in great clouds from village to village. The larks are singing and circling madly in the clear depths overhead. The bee-eaters flash like live emeralds across our path. The hoopoes strut by the wayside. At rather more than half-way across the plain we come into the midst of the harvest. Here the brown reapers, bare-legged and naked to the waist, are at work with their sickles, just as they are pictured in the tomb of T. The women and children follow, gleaning at the heels of those who bind the sheaves. The sheik in his black robe and scarlet slippers rides to and fro upon his ass, like Boaz among his people. As the sheaves are bound up, the camels carry them homeward. A camel load is 14 sheaves, 7 to each side of the hump. A little farther, and the oxen, yoked 2 and 2, are ploughing up the stubble. In a day or two the land will be sown with millet, indigo, or cotton, to be gathered in once more before the coming of the inundation. Meanwhile, as the plain lengthens behind us and the distance grows less between ourselves and the mountains, we see a line of huge irregular mounds reaching for apparently a couple of miles or more along the foot of the cliffs. From afar off the mounds look as if crowned by majestic ruins, but as we draw nearer, these outlines resolve themselves into the village of Arabat el Madfuna, which stands upon part of the mounds of Abydos. And now we come to the end of the cultivated plain, that strange line of demarcation where the inundation stops and the desert begins. Of actual desert, however, there is here but a narrow strip, forming a first step, as it were, above the alluvial plain. Next comes the artificial platform, about 1/4 of a mile in depth, on which stands the modern village, and next again, towering up sheer and steep, the great wall of limestone precipice. The village is extensive, and the houses, built in a rustic arabesque, tell of a well-to-do population. Arched gateways, ornamented with black, white, and red bricks, windows of turned lattice-work, and pigeon towers in courses of pots and bricks, give a singular picturesqueness to the place, while the slope down to the desert is covered with shrubberies and palms. Below these hanging gardens, on the edge of the desert, lies the cut corn in piles of sheaves. Here the camels are lying down to be unladen. Yonder the oxen are already treading out the grain, or chopping the straw by means of a curious sledge-like machine set with revolving rows of circular knives. Meanwhile, fluttering from heap to heap, settling on the sheaves, feeding unmolested in the very midst of the threshing floors, strutting all over the margin of the desert, trailing their wings, ruffling their plumes, cooing, curtsying, kissing, courting, filling the air with sweet sounds and setting the whole lovely idyll to a pastoral symphony of their own composing, are thousands and tens of thousands of pigeons. Now our path turns aside and we thread our way among the houses, noticing here a sculptured block built into a mud wall, yonder, beside a dried-up well, a broken alabaster sarcophagus, farther on, a granite column still erect, in the midst of a palm garden. And now, the village being left behind, we find ourselves at the foot of a great hill of newly excavated rubbish, from the top of which we presently look down into a kind of crater, and see the great temple of Abydos at our feet. It was now nearly 3 o'clock, so having seen what we could in the time, and having before us a long ride through a strange country, we left again at 6. I will not presume to describe the temples of Abydos, one of which is so ruined as to be almost unintelligible, and the other so singularly planned and so obscure in its general purport as to be a standing puzzle to archaeologists, after a short visit of 3 hours. Enough if I sketch briefly what I saw, but cursorily. Buried as it is, Abydos, even under its mounds, is a place of profound historical interest. At a time so remote that it precedes all written record of Egyptian story, there existed a little way to the northward of this site a city called Teni. We know not to what aboriginal community of prehistoric Egypt this city belonged, but here presumably the men of Khem built their first temple, evolved their first notions of art, and groped their way to an alphabet which in its origin was probably a mere picture-writing, like the picture-writing of Mexico. Hence, too, came a man named Mena, whose cartouche from immemorial time has stood first in the long list of Egyptian pharaohs. Of Mena, a shadowy figure hovering on the borderland of history and tradition, we know only that he was the first primitive chieftain who took the title of King of Upper and Lower Egypt, and that he went northward and founded Memphis. Not, however, till after some centuries was the seat of government removed to the new city. Teni, the supposed burial place of Osiris, then lost its political importance, but continued to be for long ages the holy city of Egypt. In the meanwhile, Abydos had sprung up close to Teni. Abydos, however, though an important city, was never the capital of Egypt. The seat of power shifted strangely with different dynasties, being established now in the Delta, now at Thebes, now at Elephantine, but having once departed from the site which, by reason of its central position, and the unbounded fertility of its neighbourhood, was above all others best fitted to play this great part in the history of the country, it never again returned to the point from which it had started. That point, however, was unquestionably the centre from which the great Egyptian people departed upon its wonderful career. Here was the nursery of its strength. Hence it derived its proud title to an unmixed autochthonous descent. For no greater proof of the native origin of the race can be adduced than the position which their first city occupies upon the map of Egypt. That any tribe of colonists should have made straight for the heart of the country, and there have established themselves in the midst of barbarous and probably hostile aborigines, is evidently out of the question. It is, on the other hand, equally clear that if Egypt had been colonized from Asia or Ethiopia, the strangers would on the one hand have founded their earliest settlement in the neighbourhood of the isthmus, or on the other have halted first among the well-watered plains of Nubia. But the Egyptians started from the fertile heart of their own mother country, and began by being great at home. Abydos and Teni, planted on the same platform of desert, were probably united at one time by a straggling suburb inhabited by the embalmers and other tradesfolk concerned in the business of death and burial. A chain of mounds, excavated only where the temples were situated, now stands to us for the famous city of Abydos. An ancient crude brick enclosure and an artificial tumulus mark the site of Teni. The temples and the tumulus, divided by the now exhausted necropolis, are about as distant from one another as Medinet Habu and the Ramesseum. There must have been many older temples at Abydos than these which we now see, one of which was built by Seti I, and the other by Rameses II. Or possibly, as in so many instances, the more ancient buildings were pulled down and rebuilt. Be this as it may, the Temple of Seti, as regards its sculptured decorations, is one of the most beautiful of Egyptian ruins, and as regards its plan, is one of the most singular. A row of square limestone piers, which must once have supported an architrave, are now all that remains of the façade. Immediately behind these comes a portico of 24 columns leading by 7 entrances to a hall of 36 columns. This hall again opens into 7 parallel sanctuaries, behind which lie another hall of columns and a number of small chambers. Adjoining this block, however, and leading from it by doorways at the southern end of the great hall, come several more halls and chambers connected by corridors, and conducting apparently to more chambers not yet excavated. All these piers, columns, halls, and passages, and all the 7 sanctuaries, are most delicately sculptured and brilliantly coloured. There is so far a family resemblance between temples of the same style and period, that after a little experience one can generally guess before crossing the threshold of a fresh building what one is likely to see in the way of sculptures within. But almost every subject in the Temple of Seti at Abydos is new and strange. All the gods of the Egyptian Pantheon seem to have been worshipped here, and to have had each his separate shrine. The walls are covered with paintings of these shrines and their occupants, while before each the king is represented performing some act of adoration. A huge blue frog, a greyhound, a double-headed goose, a human-bodied creature with a nilometer for its head, and many more that I can now remember, are thus depicted. The royal offerings, too, though incense and necklaces and pectoral ornaments abound, are for the most part of a kind we have not seen before. In one place the king presents to Isis a column with 4 capitals, having on the top capital a globe and 2 asps surmounted by a pair of ostrich feathers. End of section 67. 1,000 Miles Up the Nile, Section 68. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. 1,000 Miles Up the Nile by Amelia B. Edwards. Chapter 22, Abydos and Cairo, Part 2. The centre sanctuary of the seven appears to be dedicated to Khem, who seems to be here, as in the great temple of Seti at Carnac, the presiding divinity. In this principal sanctuary, which is resplendent with colour and marvellous preservation, we especially observe a portrait of Rameses II in the act of opening a door of a shrine by means of a golden key, formed like a human hand and arm. The lock seems to consist of a number of bolts of unequal length, each of which is pushed back in turn by means of the forefinger of the little hand. This doubtless gives a correct representation of the kind of locks in use at that time. It was in a corridor opening out from the great hall in this temple that Mariette discovered that precious sculpture known as the New Tablet of Abydos. In this tableau Seti I and Rameses II are seen, the one offering incense, the other reciting a hymn of praise to the names of 76 pharaohs, beginning with Mena and ending with Seti himself. To our great disappointment, though one cannot but acquiesce in the necessity for precaution, we found the entrance to this corridor closed and moulded up. A ragged old Arab who haunts the temple in the character of custode told us that the tablet could now only be seen by special permission. We seemed to have been here about half an hour when the guide came to warn us of approaching evening. We had yet the site and the great tumulus of Teni to see, the tumulus being distant about 20 minutes' ride. The guide shook his head, but we insisted on going. The afternoon had darkened over, and for the first time in many months a gathering canopy of cloud shut out the glory of sunset. We, however, mounted our donkeys and rode northwards. With better beasts we might have perhaps gained our end. As it was, seeing that it grew darker every moment, we presently gave in, and instead of trying to push on farther, contented ourselves with climbing a high mound which commanded the view towards Teni. The clouds by this time were fast closing round, and waves of shadows were creeping over the plain. To our left rose the near mountain barrier, dusk and lowering; to our right stretched the misty cornflats; at our feet, all hillocks and open graves, lay the desolate necropolis. Beyond the palms that fringed the edge of the desert, beyond a dark streak that marked the site of Teni, rose, purple in shadow against the twilight, a steep and solitary hill. This hill, called by the natives Khamis Sultan, or the Mound of the King, was the tumulus we so desired to see. Viewed from a distance, and by so uncertain a light, it looked exactly like a volcanic cone of perhaps a couple of 100 feet in height. It is, however, wholly artificial, and consists of a mass of graves heaped one above another in historical strata, each layer, as it were, the record of an era, the whole a kind of human coral reef built up from age to age with the ashes of generations. For some years past the Egyptian government had been gradually excavating this extraordinary mound. The lower it was opened, the more ancient were its contents. So steadily retrogressive indeed were the interments that it seemed as if the spade of the digger might possibly strike tombs of the first dynasty, and so restore to light relics of men who lived in the age of Mena. According to Plutarch, wrote Mariette, wealthy Egyptians came from all parts of Egypt to be buried at Abydos, in order that their bones might rest near Osiris. Very probably the tombs of Khamis Sultan belonged to those personages mentioned by Plutarch. Nor is this the only interesting attachment to the mound of Khamis Sultan. The famous tomb of Osiris cannot be far distant, and certain indications lead us to think that it is excavated in precisely that foundation of rock which serves as the nucleus of this mound. Thus the persons buried in Khamis Sultan lay as near as possible to the divine tomb. The works now in progress at this point have therefore a twofold interest. They may yield tombs more and more ancient, tombs even of the first dynasty, and some day or other they may discover to us the hitherto unknown entrance to the tomb of the god. I bitterly regretted at the time that I could not at least ride to the foot of Khamis Sultan, but I think now that I prefer to remember it as I saw it from afar off, clothed with mystery, in the gloom of that dusky evening. There was a heavy silence in the air, and a melancholy as of the burden of ages. The tumbled hillocks looked like a ghastly sea, and beyond the verge of the desert it was already night. Presently, from among the grave pits there crept towards us a slowly moving cloud. As it drew nearer, soft, filmy, shifting, unreal, it proved to be the dust raised by an immense flock of sheep. On they came, a brown, compact mass, their shepherds showing dimly now and then through openings in the cloud. The last pale gleam from above caught them for a moment ere they melted, ghost-like, into the murky plain. Then we went down ourselves, and threaded the track between the mounds and the valley. Palms and houses loomed vaguely out of the dark, and a caravan of camels, stalking by with swift and noiseless footfall, looked like shadows projected on a background of mist. As the night deepened, the air became stifling. There were no stars, and we could scarcely see a yard before us. Crawling slowly along the steep causeway, we felt but could distinguish nothing of the plain stretching away on either side. Meanwhile the frogs croaked furiously, and our donkeys stumbled at every step. When at length we drew near Samada, it was close upon 10 o'clock, and Rais Hassan had just started with men and torches to meet us. Next morning early we once again passed Gerga, with its ruined mosque and still unfallen column, and about noonday moored at a place called Asserat, where we paid a visit to a native gentleman, one Ahmed Abu Rattab Aga, to whom we carried letters of introduction. Rattab Aga owns large estates in this province, is great in horseflesh, and lives in patriarchal fashion surrounded by a numerous clan of kinsfolk and dependents. His residence at Asserat consists of a cluster of 3 or 4 large houses, a score or so of pigeon towers, an extensive garden, stabling, exercising ground, and a large courtyard, the whole enclosed by a wall of circuit, and entered by a fine arabesque gateway. He received us in a loggia of lattice work overlooking the courtyard, and had 3 of his finest horses, a grey, a bay, and a chestnut, brought out for us to admire. They were just such horses as Velasquez loved to paint, thick in the neck, small in the head, solid in the barrel, with wavy manes and long silky tails, set high and standing off straight in true Arab fashion. We doubted, however, that they were altogether pur sang. They looked wonderfully picturesque with their gold-embroidered saddle-cloths, peaked saddles covered with crimson, green, and blue velvet, long shovel stirrups and tasselled headgear. The Aga's brother and nephews put them through their paces. They knelt to be mounted, lay down and died at the word of command, dashed from perfect immobility into a furious gallop, and when at fullest speed stopped short, flung themselves back upon their haunches, and stood like horses of stone. We were told that our host had 100 such standing in his stables. Pipes, coffee, and an endless succession of different kinds of sherbets went round all the time our visit lasted, and in the course of conversation we learned that not only the wages of agricultural labourers, but even part of the taxes to the Khedive, are here paid in corn. Before leaving, L., the little lady, and the writer were conducted to the harem, and introduced to the ladies of the establishment. We found them in a separate building with a separate courtyard, living after the usual dreary way of Eastern women, with apparently no kind of occupation, and not even a garden to walk in. The Aga's principal wife, I believe he had but 2, was a beautiful woman, with auburn hair, soft brown eyes, and a lovely complexion. She received us on the threshold, led us into a saloon surrounded by a divan, and with some pride showed us her 5 children. The eldest was a graceful girl of 13, the youngest a little fellow of 4. Mother and daughter were dressed alike, in black robes embroidered with silver, pink velvet slippers on bare feet, silver bracelets and anklets, and full pink Turkish trousers. They wore their hair cut straight across the brow, plaited in long tails behind, and dressed with coins and pendants, while from the back of the head there hung a veil of thin black gauze, also embroidered with silver. Another lady, whom we took for the second wife, and who was extremely plain, had still richer and more massive ornaments, but seemed to hold an inferior position in the harem. There were perhaps a dozen women and girls in all, 2 of whom were black. One of the little boys had been ill all his short life, and looked as if he could not last many more months. The poor mother implored us to prescribe for him. It was in vain to tell her that we knew nothing of the nature of his disease, and had no skill to cure it. She still entreated, and would take no refusal, so in pity we sent her some harmless medicines. We had little opportunity of observing domestic life in Egypt. L. visited some of the vice-regal harems in Cairo, and brought away on each occasion the same impression of dreariness. A little embroidery, a few musical toys of Geneva manufacture, a daily drive on the Shubra road, pipes, cigarettes, sweetmeats, jewellery, and gossip fill up the aimless days of most Egyptian ladies of rank. There are, however, some who take an active interest in politics, and in Cairo and Alexandria the opera boxes of the Khedive and the great Pashas are nightly occupied by ladies. But it is not by the daily life of the wives of princes and nobles, but by the life of the lesser gentry and upper middle class, that a domestic system should be judged. These ladies of Assurat had no London-built brougham, no Shubra road, no opera. They were absolutely without mental resources, and they were even without the means of taking air and exercise. One could see that time hung heavy on their hands, and that they took but a feeble interest in the things around them. The harem stairs were dirty, the rooms were untidy, the general aspect of the place was slatternly and neglected. As for the inmates, though all good nature and gentleness, their faces bore the expression of people who are habitually bored. At Luxor, L. and the writer paid a visit to the wife of an intelligent and gentlemanly Arab, son of the late governor of that place. This was a middle-class harem. The couple were young, and not rich. They occupied a small house, which commanded no view and had no garden. Their little courtyard was given up to the poultry, their tiny terrace above was less than 12 feet square, and they were surrounded on all sides by houses. Yet in this stifling prison the young wife lived, apparently contented from year's end to year's end. She literally never went out. As a child, she had no doubt enjoyed some kind of liberty, but as a marriageable girl, and as a bride, she was as much a prisoner as a bird in a cage. Born and bred in Luxor, she had never seen Carnac, yet Carnac is only 2 miles distant. We asked her if she would like to go there with us, but she laughed and shook her head. She was incapable even of curiosity. It seemed to us that the wives of the fellahin were in truth the happiest women in Egypt. They work hard and are bitterly poor, but they have the free use of their limbs, and they at least know the fresh air, the sunshine, and the open fields. When we left Assurat, there still lay 335 miles between us and Cairo. From this time the navigation of the Nile became every day more difficult. The dahabeah, too, got heated through and through, so that not even sluicing and swabbing availed to keep down the temperature. At night, when we went to our sleeping cabins, the timbers alongside of our berths were as hot to the hand as a screen in front of a great fire. Our crew, though to the manner born, suffered even more than ourselves, and L. at this time had generally a case of sunstroke on her hands. One by one we passed the places we had seen on our way up: Siout, Montfalut, Gebel Abu Faida, Rhoda, Minia. After all, we did not see Beni Hassan. The day we reached that part of the river, a furious sandstorm was raging, such a storm that even the writer was daunted. 3 days later we took the rail at Biba and went on to Cairo, leaving the Philae to follow as fast as wind and weather might permit. We were so wedded by this time to dahabeah life that we felt lost at first in the big rooms at Shepherd's Hotel, and altogether bewildered in the crowded streets. Yet here was Cairo, more picturesque, more beautiful than ever. Here were the same merchants squatting on the same carpets and smoking the same pipes, in the Tunis bazaar. Here was the same old cake seller still ensconced in the same doorway in the Muski. Here were the same jewellers selling bracelets in the Khan Khalili, the same money changers sitting behind their little tables at the corners of the streets, the same veiled ladies riding on donkeys and driving in carriages, the same hurrying funerals and noisy weddings, the same odd cries and motley costumes and unaccustomed trades. Nothing was changed. We soon dropped back into the old life of sightseeing and shopping, buying rugs and silks, and silver ornaments, and old embroideries, and Turkish slippers, and all sorts of antique and pretty trifles, going from Mohammedan mosque to rare old Coptic churches, dropping in for an hour or two most afternoons at the Boulak Museum, and generally ending the day's work with a drive on the Shubra road or a stroll round the Ezbekiya gardens. End of section 68. Thousand Miles Up the Nile, section 69. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A Thousand Miles Up the Nile by Amelia B. Edwards. Chapter 22. Abydos and Cairo, Part 3. The Mawlid en-Nabi, or Festival of the Birth of the Prophet, was being held at this time in a tract of waste ground along the road to Old Cairo. Here, in some 20 or 30 large open tents, ranged in a circle, there were readings of the Koran and meetings of dervishes going on by day and night, without intermission, for nearly a fortnight. After dark, when the tents were all ablaze with lighted chandeliers, and the dervishes were howling and leaping, and fireworks were being let off from an illuminated platform in the middle of the area, the scene was extraordinary. All Cairo used to be there, on foot or in carriages, between 8 o'clock and midnight every evening, the veiled ladies of the Khedive's harem in their miniature broughams being foremost among the spectators. The Mawlid en-Nabi ends with the performance of the dosha, when the Sheikh of the Sadiya dervishes rides over a road of prostrate fanatics. L. and the writer witnessed this sight from the tent of the governor of Cairo. Drunk with opium, fasting and praying, rolling their heads and foaming at the mouth, some hundreds of wretched creatures lay down in the road packed as close as paving stones, and were walked and ridden over before our eyes. The standard-bearers came first, then a priest reading the Koran aloud, then the Sheikh on his white Arab, supported on either side by barefooted priests. The beautiful horse trod with evident reluctance, and as lightly and swiftly as possible, on the human causeway under his hoofs. The Mohammedans aver that no one is injured, or even bruised, on this holy occasion, but I saw some men carried away in convulsions, who looked as if they would never walk again. It is difficult to say but a few inadequate words of a place about which an instructive volume might be written, yet to pass the Boulak Museum in silence is impossible. This famous collection is due, in the first instance, to the liberality of the late Khedive and the labours of Mariette. With the exception of Mehemet Ali, who excavated the temple of Dendera, no previous viceroy of Egypt had ever interested himself in the archaeology of the country. Those who cared for such rubbish as encumbered the soil or lay hidden beneath the sands of the desert were free to take it, and no favour was more frequently asked or more readily granted than permission to dig for antiquities. Hence the Egyptian wealth of our museums. Hence the numerous private collections dispersed throughout Europe. Ismail Pasha, however, put an end to that wholesale pillage, and for the first time since ever mummy was sold for balsam, or for bric-a-brac, it became illegal to export antiquities. Thus, for the first time, Egypt began to possess a national collection. Youngest of great museums, the Boulak collection is the wealthiest in the world in portrait statues of private individuals, in funerary tablets, in amulets, and in personal relics of the ancient inhabitants of the Nile Valley. It is necessarily less rich in such colossal statues as fill the great galleries of the British Museum, the Turin Museum, and the Louvre. These, being above ground and comparatively few in number, were for the most part seized upon long since, and transported to Europe. The Boulak statues are the product of the tombs. The famous wooden Sheikh, about which so much has been written, the magnificent diorite statue of Khafra, or Khephren, the builder of the second pyramid, the two marvellous sitting statues of Prince Rahotep and Princess Nefert are all portraits, and, like their tombs, were executed during the lifetime of the persons represented. Crossing the threshold of the great vestibule, one is surrounded by a host of these extraordinary figures, erect, coloured, clothed, all but in motion. It is like entering the crowded anteroom of a royal palace in the time of the ancient empire. The greater number of the Boulak portrait statues are sculptured in what is called the hieratic attitude. that is, with the left arm down and pressed close to the body, the left hand holding a roll of papyrus, the right leg advanced, and the right hand raised, as grasping the walking staff. It occurred to me that there might be a deeper significance than at first sight appears in this conventional attitude, and that it perhaps suggests the moment of resurrection, when the deceased, holding fast by his copy of the Book of the Dead, walks forth from his tomb into the light of life eternal. Of all the statues here, one may say indeed of all known Egyptian statues, those of Prince Rahotep and Princess Nefert are the most wonderful. They are probably the oldest portrait statues in the world. They come from a tomb of the 3rd dynasty, and are contemporary with Snefru, a king who reigned before the time of Khufu and Khafra. That is to say, these people who sit before us side by side, coloured to the life, fresh and glowing as the day when they gave the artist his last sitting, lived at a time when the great pyramids of Giza were not yet built, and at a date which is variously calculated as from about 6300 to 4000 years before the present day. The princess wears her hair precisely as it is still worn in Nubia, and her necklace of cabochon drops is of a pattern much favoured by the modern Gawazi. The eyes of both statues are inserted. The eyeball, which is set in an eyelet of bronze, is made of opaque white quartz, with an iris of rock crystal enclosing a pupil of some kind of brilliant metal. This treatment, of which there are one or two other instances extant, gives to the eyes a look of intelligence that is almost appalling. There is a play of light within the orb, and apparently a living moisture upon the surface, which has never been approached by the most skilfully made glass eyes of modern manufacture. Of the jewels of Queen Ahotep, of the superb series of engraved scarabæi, of the rings, amulets, and toilette ornaments, of the vases in bronze, silver, alabaster, and porcelain, of the libation tables, the woven stuffs, the terracottas, the artists' models, the lamps, the silver boats, the weapons, the papyri, the 1001 curious personal relics and articles of domestic use which are brought together within these walls, I have no space to tell. Except the collection of Pompeian relics in Naples, there is nothing elsewhere to compare with the collection at Boulak, and the villas of Pompeii have yielded no such gems and jewels as the tombs of ancient Egypt. It is not too much to say that if these dead and mummied people could come back to earth, the priest would here find all the gods of his pantheon, the king his sceptre, the queen her crown jewels, the scribe his palette, the soldier his arms, the workman his tools, the barber his razors, the husbandman his hoe, the housewife her broom, the child his toys, the beauty her combs and coal bottles and mirrors. The furniture of the house is here, as well as the furniture of the tomb. Here, too, is the broken sistrum buried with the dead in token of the grief of the living. Waiting the construction of a more suitable edifice, the present building gives temporary shelter to the collection. In the meanwhile, if there was nothing else to tempt the traveller to Cairo, the Boulak Museum would alone be worth the journey from Europe. The first excursion one makes on returning to Cairo, the last one makes before leaving, is to Giza. It is impossible to get tired of the pyramids. Here L. and the writer spent their last day with the happy couple. We left Cairo early, and met all the market folk coming in from the country, donkeys and carts laden with green stuff, and veiled women with towers of baskets on their heads. The Khedive's new palace was swarming already with masons, and files of camels were bringing limestone blocks for the builders. Next comes the open corn plain, part yellow, part green, the long straight road bordered with acacias, beyond all the desert platform, and the pyramids, half in light, half in greyish-green shadow, against the horizon. I could never understand why it is that the second pyramid, though it is smaller and farther off, looks from this point of view bigger than the first. Farther on, the brown fellahin, knee-deep in purple blossom, are cutting the clover. The camels carry it away. The goats and buffaloes feed in the clearings. Then comes the halfway tomb nestled in greenery, where men and horses stay to drink, and soon we are skirting a great backwater which reflects the pyramids like a mirror. Villages, shadoofs, herds and flocks, tracts of palms, cornflats, and spaces of rich, dark fallow now succeed each other; and then once more comes the sandy slope, and the cavernous ridge of ancient yellow rock, and the great pyramid with its shadow side towards us, darkening the light of day. Neither L. nor the writer went inside the Great Pyramid. The idle man did so this day, and L.'s maid on another occasion, and both reported of the place as so stifling within, so foul under foot, and so fatiguing, that somehow we each time put it off, and ended by missing it. The ascent is extremely easy. Rugged and huge as are the blocks, there is scarcely one upon which it is not possible to find a half-way rest for the toe of one's boot, so as to divide the distance. With the help of 3 Arabs, nothing can well be less fatiguing. As for the men, they are helpful and courteous, and as clever as possible, and coax one on from block to block in all the languages of Europe. "Pazienza, Signora!" "Allez doucement!" "All serene!" "We half-way now!" "Dem halben Weg, Fräulein!" "Ne vous pressez pas, Mademoiselle!" "Ci va sano, va lontano!" "6 step more, and ecco la cima!" "You should add the other half of the proverb, amici," said I. "Ci va forte, va alla morte." My Arabs had never heard this before, and were delighted with it. They repeated it again and again, and committed it to memory with great satisfaction. I asked them why they did not cut steps in the blocks, so as to make the ascent easier for ladies. The answer was ready and honest. "No, no, mademoiselle. Arab very stupid to do that. If Arab makes good steps, Hawaji goes up alone. No more want Arab man to help him up, and Arab man earn no more dollars." They offered to sing Yankee Doodle when we reached the top, then finding we were English, shouted "God save the Queen!" and told us that the Prince of Wales had given £40 to the Pyramid Arabs when he came here with the Princess 2 years before, which, however, we took the liberty to doubt. The space on the top of the Great Pyramid is said to be 30 feet square. It is not, as I had expected, a level platform. Some blocks of the next tier remain, and 2 or 3 of the tier next above that, so making pleasant seats and shady corners. What struck us most on reaching the top was the startling nearness, to all appearance, of the second pyramid. It seemed to rise up beside us like a mountain, yet so close that I fancied I could almost touch it by putting out my hand. Every detail of the surface, every crack and party-coloured stain in the shining stucco that yet clings about the apex, was distinctly visible. The view from this place is immense. The country is so flat, the atmosphere so clear, the standpoint so isolated, that one really sees more and sees farther than from many a mountain summit of 10 or 12,000 feet. The ground lies, as it were, immediately under one, and the great necropolis is seen as in a ground plan. The effect must, I imagine, be exactly like the effect of a landscape seen from a balloon. Without ascending the pyramid, it is certainly not possible to form a clear notion of the way in which this great burial field is laid out. We see from this point how each royal pyramid is surrounded by its quadrangle of lesser tombs, some in the form of small pyramids, others partly rock-cut, partly built of massive slabs, like the roofing stones of the temples. We see how Khufu and Khafra and Menkaura lay, each under his mountain of stone, with his family and his nobles around him. We see the great causeway which moved Herodotus to such wonder, and along which the giant stones were brought. Recognizing how clearly the place is a great cemetery, one marvels at the ingenious theories which turn the pyramids into astronomical observatories and abstruse standards of measurement. They are the grandest graves in all the world, and they are nothing more. A little way to the southward, from the midst of a sandy hollow, rises the head of the Sphinx. Older than the pyramids, older than history, the monster lies couchant like a watch-dog, looking ever to the east, as if for some dawn that has not yet risen. A depression in the sand close by marks the site of that strange monument miscalled the Temple of the Sphinx. Farther away to the west, on the highest slope of this part of the desert platform, stands the pyramid of Menkaura, Mycerinus. It has lost but 5 feet of its original height, and from this distance it looks quite perfect. Such, set in a waste of desert, are the main objects, and the nearest objects on which our eyes first rest. As a whole, the view is more long than wide, being bounded to the westward by the Libyan range, and to the eastward by the Mokattam hills. At the foot of those yellow hills, divided from us by the cultivated plain across which we have just driven, lies Cairo, all glittering domes half seen through a sunlit haze. Overlooking the fairy city stands the mosque of the citadel, its mast-like minarets piercing the clearer atmosphere. Far to the northward, traversing reach after reach of shadowy palm groves, the eye loses itself in the dim and fertile distances of the delta. To the west and south all is desert. It begins here at our feet, a rolling wilderness of valleys and slopes and rivers and seas of sand, broken here and there by abrupt ridges of rock, and mounds of ruined masonry, and open graves. A silver line skirts the edge of this dead world, and vanishes southward in the sun mist that shimmers on the farthest horizon. To the left of that silver line we see the quarried cliffs of Tura, marble white; opposite Tura the plumy palms of Memphis. On the desert platform above, clear though faint, the pyramids of Abu Sir and Saqqara and Dashur. Every stage of the pyramid of Osinephes, banded in light and shade, is plain to see. So is the dome-like summit of the great pyramid of Dashur. Even the brick ruin beside it, which we took for a black rock as we went up the river, and which looks like a black rock still, is perfectly visible. Farthest of them all, showing pale and sharp amid the palpitating blaze of noon, stands, like an unfinished Tower of Babel, the pyramid of Medum. It is in this direction that our eyes turn oftenest, to the measureless desert in its mystery of light and silence, to the Nile where it gleams out again and again, till it melts at last into that faint, far distance beyond which lie Thebes and Philae and Abu Simbel. Read by Dr. Heather and By, Carrollton, Georgia, June 2007. End of section 69. A Thousand Miles Up the Nile, Section 70. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A Thousand Miles Up the Nile by Amelia B. Edwards. Appendix 1. A. McCallum, Esquire, to the Editor of the Times. This letter appeared in the Times of March 18, 1874. Sir, it may interest your readers to learn that at the south side of the great temple of Abu Simbel I found the entrance to a painted chamber rock cut, and measuring 21 feet 2 1/2 inches by 14 feet 8 inches, and 12 feet high to the spring of the arch, elaborately sculptured and painted in the best style of the best period of Egyptian art, bearing the portraits of Rameses the Great and his cartouches, and in a state of the highest preservation. This chamber is preceded by the ruins of a vaulted atrium, in sun-dried brickwork, and adjoins the remains of what would appear to be a massive wall or pylon, which contains a staircase terminating in an arched doorway leading to the vaulted atrium before mentioned. The doorway of the painted chamber, the staircase, and the arch, were all buried in sand and debris. The chamber appears to have been covered and lost sight of since a very early period, being wholly free from mutilation and from the scribbling of travellers, ancient and modern. The staircase was not opened until the 18th, and the bones of a woman and child, with 2 small cinerary urns, were there discovered by a gentleman of our party, buried in the sand. This was doubtless a subsequent interment. Whether this painted chamber is the inner sanctuary of a small temple, or part of a tomb, or only a speos, like the well-known grottos at Ibrim, is a question for future excavators to determine. I have the honour to be, sir, yours, etc., etc., Andrew McCallum, Carrasco, Nubia, February 16th, 1874. End of section 70. 1,000 Miles Up the Nile, Section 71. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. 1,000 Miles Up the Nile by Amelia B. Edwards. Appendix 2. The Egyptian Pantheon. The deities of ancient Egypt consist of celestial, terrestrial, and infernal gods, and of many inferior personages, either representatives of the greater gods or else attendants upon them. Most of the gods were connected with the sun, and represented that luminary in its passage through the upper hemisphere or heaven, and the lower hemisphere or Hades. To the deities of the solar cycle belonged the great gods of Thebes and Heliopolis. In the local worship of Egypt, the deities were arranged in local triads. Thus, at Memphis, Ptah, his wife Meriemptah, and their son Nefer-Atum formed a triad, in which was sometimes added the goddess Bast or Bubastis. At Abydos the local triad was Osiris, Isis, and Horus, with Nephthys. At Thebes, Amun-Ra or Amun, Mut, and Khons, with Neith. At Elephantine, Kneph, Anuka, Seti, and Hak. In most instances the names of the gods are Egyptian, thus Ptah meant the opener. Amun, the concealed, Ra, the sun or day, Athor, the house of Horus, but some few, especially of later times, were introduced from Semitic sources as Baal or Baal, Astarata or Astarte, Ken or Kian, Respu or Respeth. Besides the principal gods, several inferior or parhedral gods, sometimes personifications of the faculties, senses, and other objects, are introduced into the religious system, and genii, spirits, or personified souls of deities formed part of the same. At a period subsequent to their first introduction, the gods were divided into three orders. The first or highest comprised 8 deities, who were different in the Memphian and Theban systems. They were supposed to have reigned over Egypt before the time of mortals. The 8 gods of the first order at Memphis were 1. Ptah, 2. Shu, 3. Tefnu, 4. Seb, 5. Nut, 6. Osiris, 7. Isis and Horus, 8. Athor. Those of Thebes were 1. Amun-Ra, 2. Mentu, 3. Atum, 4. Shu and Tefnu, 5. Seb, 6. Osiris, 7. Set and Nephthys, 8. Horus and Athor. The gods of the second order were 12 in number, but the name of one only, an Egyptian Hercules, has been preserved. The third order is stated to have comprised Osiris, who, it will be seen, belonged to the first order. Guide to the First and Second Egyptian Rooms, British Museum, S. Birch, 1874. The gods most commonly represented upon the monuments are Ptah, Khnum, Ra, Amun-Ra, Kem, Osiris, Nefer-Atum or Tum, Thoth, Seb, Set, Khons, Horus, Mot, Neith, Isis, Nut, Hathor, and Bast. They are distinguished by the following attributes. Ptah, or Ptah, in form a mummy, holding the emblem called by some the Nilometer, by others the emblem of stability. Called the father of the beginning, the creator of the egg of the sun and moon. Chief deity of Memphis. Kneph, Khnum, or Knuphis, ram-headed, called the maker of gods and men, the soul of the gods, chief deity of Elephantine and the cataracts. Ra, hawk-headed and crowned with the sun disk encircled by an asp. The divine disposer and organizer of the world, adored throughout Egypt. Amun-Ra, of human form, crowned with a flat-topped cap and 2 long straight plumes, clothed in the shenty, his flesh sometimes painted blue. There are various forms of this god, but he is generally described as king of the gods. Chief deity of Thebes. Kem, of human form mummified, wears headdress of Amun-Ra, his right hand uplifted, holding the flail. The god of productiveness and generation. Chief deity of Chemnis or Ekhmim. is identified in later times with Amen and called Amen-Kem. Osiris, of human form, mummified, crowned with a mitre and holding the flail and crook. Called the Good Being, the Lord above all, the One Lord. Was the god of the lower world, judge of the dead, and representative of the sun below the horizon. Adored throughout Egypt. Local deity of Abydos. Nefer-Atem. Human-headed and crowned with the Shent. This god represented the setting sun, or the sun descending to light the lower world. Local deity of Heliopolis. Thoth. In form a man, ibis-headed, generally depicted with the pen and palette of a scribe. Was the god of the moon and of letters. Local deity of Sessun or Homopolis. Seb. The father of the gods, and deity of terrestrial vegetation. In form a man with a goose upon his head. Set. Represented by a symbolic animal with muzzle and ears like a jackal, the body of an ass, and an upright tail like the tail of a lion. Was originally a warlike god, and became in later times the symbol of evil and the enemy of Osiris. Khans. Hawk-headed, crowned with the sun disk and horns. Is represented sometimes as a youth with the sidelock, standing on a crocodile. Horus. Horus appears variously as Horus, Horus Erotes, and Horus Harpacrates, or Horus the Child. Is represented under the first two forms as a man, hawk-headed, wearing the double crown of Egypt, in the latter as a child with the sidelock. Local deity of Edfu. Apollinopolis Magna. Mot. A woman draped and crowned with the Shent, generally with a cap below the Shent representing a vulture. Adored at Thebes. Neith. A woman draped, holding sometimes a bow and arrows, crowned with the crown of Lower Egypt. She presided over war and the loom, worshipped at Thebes. Isis. A woman crowned with the sun disk surmounted by a throne and sometimes enclosed between horns. Adored at Abydos and Philae. Her soul resided in Sothis, or the dog star. Nut. A woman curved so as to touch the ground with her fingers. She represents the vault of heaven, and is the mother of the gods. Hathor. Cow-headed and crowned with the disk and plumes. Deity of Amenti, or the Egyptian Hades. Worshipped at Dendera. Bast and Sekhet. Bast and Sekhet appear to be two forms of the same goddess. As Sekhet she is represented as a woman, lion-headed, with the disk and uraeus; as Bast she is cat-headed and holds a sistrum. Adored at Bubastis. End of section 71. Thousand Miles Up the Nile, section 72. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. 1,000 Miles Up the Nile by Amelia B. Edwards. Appendix 3. The Religious Beliefs of the Egyptians. Did the Egyptians believe in one eternal God, whose attributes were merely symbolized by their numerous deities, or must the whole structure of their faith be resolved into a solar myth, with its various and inevitable ramifications? This is the great problem of Egyptology, and it is a problem that has not yet been solved. Egyptologists differ so widely on the subject that it is impossible to reconcile their opinions. As not even the description of a temple is complete without some reference to this important question, and as the question itself underlies every notion we may form of an ancient Egyptian and ancient Egyptians, I have thought it well to group here a few representative extracts from the works of one or two of the greatest authorities upon the subject. Quote, "The religion of the Egyptians consisted of an extended polytheism represented by a series of local groups. The idea of a single deity self-existing or produced was involved in the conception of some of the principal gods, who are said to have given birth to or produced gods, men, all beings and things. Other deities were considered to be self-produced. The sun was the older object of worship, and in his various forms, as the rising, midday, and setting sun, was adored under different names, and was often united, especially at Thebes, to the types of other deities, as Amun and Mentu. The oldest of all the local deities, Ptah, who was worshipped at Memphis, was a demiurgus or creator of heaven, earth, gods, and men, and not identified with the sun. Besides the worship of the solar gods, that of Osiris extensively prevailed, and with it the antagonism of Set, the Egyptian devil, the metempsychosis, or transmigration of the soul, the future judgment, the purgatory or Hades, the Carnator, the Alua or Elysium, and final union of the soul to the body after the lapse of several centuries. Besides the deities of heaven, the light, and the lower world, others personified the elements or presided over the operations of nature, seasons, and events. Guide to the First and Second Egyptian Rooms, British Museum, S. Birch, 1874. Quote, "This religion, obscured as it is by a complex mythology, has lent itself to many interpretations of a contradictory nature, none of which have been unanimously adopted. But that which is beyond doubt, and which shines forth from the text for the whole world's acceptance, is the belief in one God. The polytheism of the monuments is but an outward show. The innumerable gods of the Pantheon are but manifestations of the one Being in his various capacities. That taste for allegory which created the hieroglyphic writing found vent likewise in the expression of the religious idea, that idea being, as it were, stifled in the later periods by a too abundant symbolism." P. Perret, Dictionnaire d'Archéologie Égyptienne, 1875, translated from article on religion. The God of the Egyptians was unique, perfect, endued with knowledge and intelligence, and so far incomprehensible that one can scarcely say in what respects he is incomprehensible. He is the one who exists by essence, the one sole life of all substance, the one single generator in heaven and earth who is not himself engendered, the Father of fathers, the Mother of mothers, always the same, immutable in immutable perfection, existing equally in the past, the present, and the future. He fills the universe in such wise that no earthly image can give the feeblest notion of his immensity. He is felt everywhere, he is tangible nowhere. G. Maspero, translated from Histoire ancienne des peuples de l'Orient. Paris, 1876, Chapter 1, page 26. Quote, "Unfortunately, the more we study the religion of ancient Egypt, the more our doubts accumulate with regard to the character which must finally be attributed to it. The excavations carried on of late at Dendera and Edfu have opened up to us an extraordinary fertile source of material. These temples are covered with text, and present precisely the appearance of two books which authoritatively treat not only of the gods to which these two temples are dedicated, but of the religion under its more general aspects. But neither in these temples, nor in those which have been long known to us, appears the one God of Jamblichus. If Amun is the first of the first at Thebes, if Ptah is at Memphis, the father of all beings without beginning or end, so also is every other Egyptian god separately endowed with these attributes of the divine being. In other words, we everywhere find gods who are uncreate and immortal, but nowhere that unique, invisible deity, without name and without form, who was supposed to hover above the highest summit of the Egyptian Pantheon. The Temple of Dendera, now explored to the end of its most hidden inscriptions, of a certainty furnishes no trace of this deity. The one result which above all others seems to be adduced from the study of this temple is that, according to the Egyptians, the universe was God himself, and that pantheism formed the foundation of their religion. Amelia B, translated from Itinéraire de la Haute Egypte, Alexandria, 1872, page 54. Quote, "The sun is the most ancient object of Egyptian worship found upon the monuments. His birth each day, when he springs from the bosom of the nocturnal heaven, is the natural emblem of the eternal generation of the divinity. Hence the celestial space became identified with the Divine Mother. It was particularly the nocturnal heaven which was represented by this personage. The rays of the sun, as they awakened all nature, seemed to give life to animated beings. Hence, that which doubtless was originally a symbol became the foundation of the religion. It is the sun himself whom we find habitually invoked as the Supreme Being. The addition of his Egyptian name Ra to the names of certain local divinities would seem to show that this identification constituted a second epoch in the history of the religions of the valley of the Nile. Viscount E. de Rouget, translated from Notices sommaires des Monuments Egyptiens du Louvre, Paris, 1873, page 120. That religion, whether based on a solar myth, or upon a genuine belief in a spiritual God, became grossly material in its later developments, is apparent to every student of the monuments. M. Maspero has the following remarks on the degeneration of the old faith. Quote, "In the course of ages, the sense of the religion became obscured. In the text of Greek and Roman date, that lofty conception of the divinity which had been cherished by the early theologians of Egypt still peeps out here and there. Fragmentary phrases and epithets yet prove that the fundamental principles of the religion are not quite forgotten. For the most part, however, we find that we no longer have to do with the infinite and intangible God of ancient days, but rather with a God of flesh and blood who lives upon the earth, and has so abased himself as to be no more than a human king. It is no longer this God of whom no man knew either the form or the substance. It is Kneph at Esna, Hathor at Dendera, Horus, king of the divine dynasty, at Edfu. This king has a court, ministers, an army, a fleet. His eldest son, Horhat, prince of Cush and heir presumptive to the throne, commands the troops. His first minister, Thoth, the inventor of letters, has geography and rhetoric at his fingers' ends, is historiographer royal, and is entrusted with the duty of recording the victories of the king and of celebrating them in high-sounding phraseology. When this god makes war upon his neighbor Typhon, he makes no use of the divine weapons of which we should take it for granted that he could dispose at will. He calls out his archers and his chariots, descends the Nile in his galley, as might the last new pharaoh, directs marches and countermarches, fights battle plans, carries cities by storm, and brings all Egypt in submission to his feet. We see here that the Egyptians of Ptolemaic times had substituted for the one god of their ancestors a line of god-kings, and had embroidered these modern legends with a host of fantastic details. G. Maspero, translated from Histoire ancienne des Peuples de l'Orient, Paris, 1876, Chapter 1, pages 50 through 51. End of section 72. A Thousand Miles Up the Nile, section 73. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A Thousand Miles Up the Nile by Amelia B. Edwards. Appendix 4. Egyptian Chronology. The chronology of Egypt has been a disputed point for centuries. The Egyptians had no cycle, and only dated in the regnal years of their monarchs. The principal Greek sources have been the Canon of Ptolemy, drawn up in the 2nd century A.D., and the lists of the dynasties extracted from the historical work of Manetho, an Egyptian priest who lived in the time of Ptolemy Philadelphus, B.C. 285 to 247. The discrepancies between these lists and the monuments have given rise to many schemes and rectifications of the chronology. The principal chronological points of information obtained from the monuments are the conquest of Egypt by Cambyses, B.C. 527, the commencement of the reign of Psammetichus I, B.C. 665, the reign of Tirhakah, about B.C. 693, and that of Bokhyrus, about B.C. 720, the synchronism of the reign of Shishak I with the capture of Jerusalem, about B.C. 970. The principal monuments throwing light on other parts of the chronology are the recorded heliacal risings of Sothis, or the Dog Star, in the reigns of Thutmose III and Ramesses II, III, VI, IX, the date of 400 years from the time of Ramesses II to the Shepherd Kings, the dated sepulchre tablets of the bull Apis at the Serapeum, the lists of kings at Saqqara, Thebes, and Abydos, the chronological canon of the Turin Papyrus, and other incidental notices. But of the anterior dynasties no certain chronological dates are afforded by the monuments, those hitherto proposed not having stood the test of historical or philological criticism. S. Birch, LL.D., Guide to the First and Second Egyptian Rooms at the British Museum, 1874, page 10. As some indication of the wide divergence of opinion upon this subject, it is enough to point out that the German Egyptologists alone differ as to the date of Menes or Mena, the first authentic king of the ancient empire, to the following extent. Bock places Mena in B.C. 5702. Unger places Mena in B.C. 5613. Brugsch places Mena in B.C. 4455. Loth places Mena in B.C. 4157. Lepsius places Mena in B.C. 3892, and Bunsen places Mena in B.C. 3623. Note from your reader. The remainder of Appendix 4 appears in table form and is difficult to communicate in audio form. In addition, much has been discovered in the 120 years since this book was written, and therefore the Egyptian chronology contained in these tables is rather wildly incorrect, as compared to accepted theories of modern Egyptologists. Therefore, the remainder of Appendix 4 has been omitted. End of reader's note. End of section 73. Miles Up the Nile, section 74. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. 1,000 Miles Up the Nile by Amelia B. Edwards. Appendix 5. Contemporary Chronology of Egypt, Mesopotamia, and Babylon. A very important addition to our chronological information with regard to the synchronous history of Egypt, Palestine, Syria, Mesopotamia, and Babylonia has been brought to light during this present year, 1888, by the great discovery of cuneiform tablets at Tel el Amarna in Upper Egypt. These tablets consist for the most part of letters and dispatches sent to Amenhotep III and Amenhotep IV by the kings of Babylonia and the princes and governors of Palestine, Syria, and Mesopotamia. Some being addressed to Amenhotep IV, Khuen-Aten, by Bernaburyas, king of Babylonia, who lived about B.C. 1430. This gives us the date of the life and reign of Amenhotep IV, and consequently the approximate date of the foundation of the city known to us as Tel el Amarna, and of the establishment of the new religion of the disk worship, and it is the earliest synchronism yet established between the history of ancient Egypt and that of any of her contemporaries. From these tablets we also learn that the consort of Amenhotep IV was a Syrian princess, and daughter of Dushrata, king of Naharina, called in the tablets the land of Mitanni, on the upper Euphrates. For a full and learned description of some of the most interesting of these newly discovered documents, see Dr. Ehrman's paper, entitled Der Tantefellfund von Tel Amarna, read before the Berlin Academy on the 3rd of May, 1888. The End. End of section 74. End of 1,000 Miles Up the Nile by Amelia B. Edwards. Read by Dr. Heather and By, June, 2007, Carrollton, Georgia.